So if you have been listening to the Secondary Science Simplified for a while now, since we started, you'll probably notice that I always try to make my podcast episodes serve both new and veteran teachers alike, because I know that there are a variety of you all who listen to this. But unfortunately, sometimes I can't always serve everyone, and today's topic is one of those instances. But it's something that has been asked about enough that I feel like I need to take the time to address it. So many of you newer teachers who are listening, you might be dreading your very first formal observations or informal observations this year by your admin. And I know this because so many of you have sent me questions on this. And veteran teachers listening, you may be at the point where you don't even notice when someone walks in and out of your room. So I know that this episode may not be for you. And if that is the case, I recommend sharing it with a new teacher at your school and then just coming back next week, because next week's episode will be for everyone. But this week is really for anyone who, if you're thinking about an impending observation, whether it's planned or totally spontaneous, if just thinking about it kind of makes your hands sweat, makes you a little nervous, then this episode is for you. I'm going to share exactly what you need to do to nail your first or maybe your next observation and every one after that. We'll talk about, why I'm the right person to talk on this. And we'll also talk about how to prepare and then what to do when it actually happens. So let's get into it. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I am passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You are in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. First and foremost, I am not an expert on all things, of course, as no one is, but I am a person who is well equipped to teach on this topic, because at my first teaching job, it was a school-wide policy, rhythm, I don't even know, but an admin came through your room every single day. Y'all, this is not an exaggeration. It was an expectation. It was woven into the fabric of the way that the school was run. There's going to be an admin who comes in your room every single day unannounced. We had 5 assistant principals and then the head principal. So that was 6 different people who would kind of rotate through. So typically you would see each of those people about once a week, with how that math works out. So it just became the norm. And so I feel like I had to become desensitized to this and really become equipped for it also on the front end, so that this wouldn't completely freak me out as a brand new teacher. And the way that they would do it, which was so funny. So I know most of y'all know the majority of my teaching experience was in a non-lab classroom, no lab supplies, no running water, no gas connection, of course, none of that. But my first 2 years, I was in a totally different school, a very large public school, great funding. I had an amazing classroom. I had a lecture space in the front. I had 4 really long lab tables in the back with gas and water. And then I had a lab prep room that connected me to another teacher. I had no idea how spoiled I was, y'all. Let me tell you, okay? But the way the room was set up, there was a door in the back of the room, and all of our doors had to stay locked at all times, just from a security standpoint. So the only warning you had was kind of the jiggle of keys as someone was unlocking the back door. And so someone would come in through the back door. Typically, if we were, not in a lab, we'd be at the front in in more of the lecture space. And they just come in, and sometimes they just stand in the back and stare. Other times they come in and they find an empty seat. The head principal was the worst about this. It didn't matter. He wanted to sit with the students. So he would sit in the back row. Sometimes if the only space, when I had a class of 32 was in the front and someone was absent, he'd come sit in the front. He did not care. He had no qualms about that. And he was the worst because he would just start whispering to students and asking them questions. He loved to kind of quiz the students. Be like, hey, tell me what she's talking about right now. Hey, she has the words diploid and haploid on the board. What do those mean? He would just start asking them questions. The other principals were a little bit more low key, would kind of come in, stand, make their observation, write their notes, and leave. And that was it. But I tell you all this to tell you, like, I get it. Like, I had to get used to this. And I actually am so grateful for it because it humbled me in a way that I don't think I would have been humbled. It really had me always putting my best foot forward, knowing that like someone's always watching essentially. And honestly, in the age of technology that we're in, like someone could always be watching. Like your kids could always have a camera up. You just need to act like there's always an audience. All of that to say, that's kind of the context for which I come to this. So how do you prepare for that? What did I do? And this is not something I did well right away. It's something I got better with over time. But I think the first thing is you need to get clear expectations from your admin. For example, especially if this is going to be a planned kind of observation, if they straight up tell you, I think the planned observations actually hold more weight than the unplanned because they're straight up saying, I'm coming, so you better be ready. I feel like there's more grace when they just kind of bop in unannounced and it's like they don't even know what they're walking into. What can they expect you to kind of do in that moment? You know what I'm saying? But if it's going to be a planned situation, I would ask like, hey, what specific things are you looking for here? Like, do you want to see how I run a lab? Do you want to see how I lecture? And they may say, just do whatever you want to do, which is fine. But I think getting clarity on that is important of what do they want to see? What would be helpful for them? And then if you can kind of arrange your schedule around that, then do so. If you can't, I don't think it matters. We have so many other variables in our job. We have to work around with fire drills and spirit weeks. Like, I'm not going to rearrange my entire life for an observation. Now, regardless of if it's planned or unplanned, they just show up. I do think it's good to get some clarity. And if you haven't had a chance to do this before they do this, just ask them after they've come by, swing by their office and be like, hey, like I saw you popped in today. In the future, what is your expectation? Or would you like to be ignored or would you like to be addressed? This is something I learned from all my experience of observations. Like the assistant principals wanted to be ignored. They wanted just to come in. They wanted to assess the scene, get what they needed to get, and they wanted to walk out. They did not want me to greet them, make a scene. Our head principal wanted me to like pretend like I just keep on going, but then he definitely kind of wanted to make a scene. He kind of had that personality where he like wanted his presence to be known. And so I would ask him like, do you want to be ignored or addressed? And he's always like, you can address me. And so then often if I heard him whispering to the kid next to him, hey, tell me about diploid, haploid, and it was a kid I knew would be like stressed about this, I would be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like I would call him out, be like, hey, no interruptions in this class. What question you have, Miss? I'm not going to say his name, Mr. R. And then I'd let him ask the question and then I'd say, who can help him? Who can explain to him what this is? And I would start to bring him in. So I think finding out what kind of they want here on that, I think is helpful. Seeing if they want to be brought in, if they don't want to be brought in. I think knowing that is going to give you a lot of clarity in terms of how to just approach them so you don't just panic and, freeze up as they're talking to you. Okay. The next thing I think you need to do to prepare is make sure you are meeting all mandates. Okay. So if you have like a school policy that you're going to always have an agenda on the board, make sure you have an agenda on the board. If you have a school policy that you will have your objectives, your, students will be able to swap bat statements on the board, then make sure you have those objectives on the board. So make sure you're meeting those mandates and make sure that's just in your regular routine and rhythm so that you're not scrambling like, oh, I have an observation. I better figure out what my objectives are. Like if there's a school policy, put them on the board, get in the habit of it. It's annoying, but then you're always prepared. The next thing I think is so important is like preparing your students, but not like preparing them for an observation. I'm not saying you need to be like, okay, guys, we're all on the same team. If the principal comes in, here's what we're going to do. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is you need to have routines and rhythms and procedures in your class so that your students know how they're expected to act at all times, not just when there's an observation. I think the only way you fail an observation is if your students out you for trying to be different than you are when the observer's not there. The most important thing is that you are authentic to who you are. You run the same classroom, whether you're observed or not. And so we want to establish routines and procedures and train our students in them so that they know how to run the class, so that if you do have to call someone out for a disciplinary issue, or if something does come up, you have a refrain, you have a system, you have a process, and it doesn't shock your students at all. So if you don't even know where to get started on teaching these things, I'm like insanely passionate about this. Check out episode 91 of the podcast. I'll link it in the show notes. It's my top 5 routines and procedures I think all teachers need to teach and train their students in. But I train my students in way more than that because I'm really passionate about this. I also have an entire virtual professional development mini course on classroom culture. It's my culture mini course, mini unit. I will link that in the show notes as well. You can also go to itsnorocketscienceclassroom.com/PD. Just check out the culture one. It's about classroom management, but it's about just the entire culture of your classroom, the physical space, the, emotional space, the mental space, how you practically run it, all of that stuff. So if you feel like episode 91, kind of whets your appetite and you want more, then you would probably benefit from that culture mini course. But we need to make sure these things are established. Like for me, my students know we're going to have this bell ringer. We're going to go over it and then we're going to go into this. This is how we handle notes. This is how you ask questions. This is how you go to the bathroom. There's not going to be these disruptions. And if there are, they know how I'm going to respond to them. And I'm not going to surprise them by having different behavior in front of an observer than I would without that observer. Another episode that could be helpful is episode 135. It's all about using anticipatory conversations to diffuse classroom chaos. And this is something I do all the time. It's one of my pinnacle classroom management strategies, but also parenting strategies. And I think you can use this too when you have an upcoming planned observation. Say, hey, Mr. Johnson's going to come on Friday to observe. Here's my expectations for how you guys behave. Do you have any questions about that? Here are going to be the consequences if we don't behave this way. But I also just don't think it should matter whether it's planned or not. You should be having conversations of this is the behavior that's tolerated in my classroom. This is the behavior that's not. And if you don't follow, I will give you one warning. And my one warning is, hey, this is the reminder of how we do things in this classroom. And you can have a choice to do things, this way, or you can have a choice to not be a part of this classroom. What's your choice? And you give them that opportunity to kind of replay it. Sometimes they just need a minute to replay the conversation. But using those conversations will be really helpful, especially if a student is disrespectful to you in class, which we'll talk more about in a minute. I think the other thing in terms of being prepared is it doesn't matter what your lesson plan is. I think sometimes we panic and we are we need the flashiest lesson plan on a day of an observation. And that is not true. They learn so much from just seeing how you interact with students, with how you lecture, with how you engage your students, with just, again, how you run the classroom. I think our admin care way more about how the class is run than on what you're actually doing in teaching. They don't even know your content most likely. You might have one admin if you have 6 people like me that has a science background like I did, but the chances are slim. So it's way more about how you're doing, not what you're doing. I like to have a really consistent rhythm in my class. I have an anatomy of a class period little cheat sheet. There's a 50-minute side and a 90-minute side in terms of how I would break up the class period. I'm doing that every day. So I don't need to change things up to try to impress my admin. That's pretty much what we're following. I'll link that in the show notes so you can see that too. But I'm just going to follow that. And I think the nice thing is your admin's going to observe you multiple times throughout the year. If you're including enough variety in your unit plans, then you don't need to worry about having variety every single day. I have another virtual PD course all about lessons and lesson planning and doing it holistically. I'm really passionate about planning all your lessons for a unit at one time so that you can make sure you get variety throughout the unit, especially if you have 40, 45, 50-minute lesson classroom periods. It's impossible to have a lesson plan that has a little bit of lecture, a little bit of discussion, a little bit of inquiry activity, a little bit of lab. You can't do it all in one day. So just make sure that you have that variety throughout the course of your unit plan. And then let's say they show up unannounced and it happens to be the one heavier lecture day that you have all semester. And you're dang it, they're going to think I'm boring, whatever. This is where you keep a printed version of your unit plan out. I always like to have one accessible, especially for a last minute sub or something like that. Or if you can just email it to them after the observation if you don't have one on hand and just say hey, thanks so much for coming by the class. It was a little bit heavier of a lecture day than normal. And you can highlight, this is where we were today. Here's where we're going tomorrow and throughout the rest of the unit if you want to come back another day to see something a little bit more fun or a little bit more engaging. And then when they see that, it gives you some ideas too. I think that's a lot of people's biggest fears is, oh no, they're going to pop in while I'm lecturing and they're going to think all I do is lecture. Or the opposite, they're going to pop in during a lab and it's going to be mass chaos and I'm going to look like such a novice here. So I think you need to not worry about that. There's going to be a variety in your days. Sometimes there's going to be lecture, sometimes there's going to be lab, and it is what it is. You need to let go of having the perfect lesson plan on the day they come. I do think though, there are strategies you can use to make lecture engaging. No matter how you do that. I have an episode about this, episode 6 of the podcast. I'll link in the show notes that you can listen to. I will say to you, I feel really confident about this as well because at the second school I taught in, we had a lot of teacher observations, like coworker observations. My department chair had to observe me once a quarter. And then other teachers, we were all responsible for observing other teachers in our building. I can't remember if it was 2 times a year or 2 times a semester, but I always had my coworkers coming in and those were typically planned. But the benefit of that was I got a lot of affirmation from my coworkers on how I just did simple stuff like lecture or run a bell ringer. Actually, to the point where my coworkers actually asked my admin if I would lead a professional development for our faculty about bell ringers because they liked how I did my prime times, which is funny because this was all before I started doing SR Rocket Science. And now I talk about prime times like it's my 4th child. So I just think don't worry about being flashy. You don't know what's actually impressive to them and what's not. So just stick with the same old, but make sure you're running your classroom smoothly. And that's where having that established culture, having those routines and procedures, like I mentioned, that's going to be what makes the difference. How you run the class, not what you are doing. Okay. So that's how I feel like you can kind of prepare here. Now, additional tips for if they tell you I'm coming Thursday, I would be great. Is there anything you'd specifically like to see while you're here? Okay, so let's say the first time they came, you were lecturing the whole time. Say, hey, would you like to see how a lab goes? Or maybe vice versa. And if they have something they specifically want to see, if you can rearrange the schedule, that's great. If not, I think you tell them. Be like, hey, we have a test that day. Or hey, it's a review day before a test. It's not going to be the most exciting day, but you're welcome to come anytime. I do think you're allowed to give them a preface there of I don't think you need to bend over backward to rearrange your unit plans to impress them. I feel like I've said that before, but I just feel like it's important to emphasize. But you can give them a heads up hey, that's fine. You're welcome to come anytime. I have nothing to hide. But just FYI, we're working on this and that is what it is. And then you just show them what you can about how you run your classroom, whether it's a review day or a test day or whatever. Now, when they show up, whether this is announced or unannounced, the most important thing is that you stay calm. Someone told me once that 90% of parenting is being the calmest person in the room at all times. And I remember thinking that won't be hard. And then I became a parent and I'm like, wow, this is impossible. But I kind of think that's how teaching is too, especially when we have conflicts with students, is just stay calm. I think the next most important thing is you need to be true to yourself. Again, your students are going to call you out if you start acting some type of way that is not how you always act. They are going to smell your fear if you start acting different. So just be yourself. That's so important. I have a core values mini course in my virtual PD offerings that is all about identifying who you are, what your giftings are, letting go of the things that are not your forte and just leaning into what you're really good at and what are your natural leanings. And that could really help you if confidence in who you are as a teacher is a place that you struggle. I would check out that core values mini course. So stay calm, be true to yourself, and then keep on keeping on. Do not change what you're doing. Just ignore them unless they specifically asked you to address them. Just ignore them. It's about how you're teaching, not what you're teaching. Now, the biggest thing I hear though is what if my students are crazy when they come in? Especially if they told me they were coming and then I prep my students and then my students are still rude, they're still disrespectful or something happens. Okay, first and foremost, remain the calmest person in the room. Second, this is where having established those routines and procedures, having had those anticipatory conversations comes into play because you can stay calm. This is not about you. This is a situation. You're going to reiterate the consequences of if the situation continues and then give them an option to make a choice. And then you're just going to reinforce. Clear communication, consistent reinforcement. That is the backbone of classroom management, in my opinion, especially when dealing with larger classroom management issues and behavior issues. I really believe that individual issues are best fixed on a relational level, and then larger, in front of the whole class, groups of students issues are fixed on a procedural level. So this is where having those procedures, having those relationships is a game changer, but just stay calm regardless. And then my other advice is don't do anything differently than you would if the principal wasn't there. Hey, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe your 4th period is out of control and you've told your principal this. And so they come to see it. And like, I'm kind of glad they're seeing it because now they can see what you're dealing with. Then you can now respond and do the best you can. And then you have an opportunity to receive feedback later from your principal. Hey, what could I have done differently? Like this could actually be really helpful for them to see. I think of this too with regards to parenting in public versus at home. Like if my child starts having a fit in Target or I recently did a trip with one of my children, our first trip, just us two together. And there were some things said in public that people overheard that I would not like for people to overhear my child say. And it feels like it's a reflection on me as a parent. But I always tell myself, this is not about correcting my image when one of my children does something that I don't want them to do in public. This is about correcting the behavior and restoring the relationship with that student, with my child, but also with your students here in this situation. This should not be about me. It's about them. And like, let's heal this. So I'm not going to put on a show, put on a front of like sternness and discipline about something. I'm going to stay calm and be like, whoa, hey, we don't talk like that in our house. Remember, I'm going to give you opportunity to rephrase what you just said. Instead of being like, oh no, I'm going to protect myself as the parent and be like, don't you backtalk me like sister or whatever. You're going to stay calm. Okay. And again, act the same as you would in public than you would at home. And again, sometimes a lot of these kinds of corrections do not need to happen in public. So even though everyone heard it, like in the airport for me, or the principal saw it in your classroom, I don't think that means you need to then correct it in front of everyone who saw, almost to like show that you're fixing things. I think you can take them away into a private space and have that conversation not on display. Because I think sometimes they want that attention from everyone and they want to see what you're going to do in front of everyone. And you don't need to do that. So sometimes that's the most appropriate response. So again, stay calm. If something goes badly, it's not the end of the world. Honestly, it could be for the best because now you have evidence that they've seen and you can get some help. Okay, so speaking of help, let's talk about after the eval, after the observation. Maybe they just email it to you. Maybe they ask you to come in their office. Whatever it may be, I think this is an opportunity for humility and to prepare your heart for critique. Everything is a learning opportunity and you don't need to get defensive here. I often get critiques in my email from teachers about things that maybe I've said on the internet or that I've done in my curriculum or whatever, and it hurts. And I'm not saying it doesn't hurt. I am not saying that criticism doesn't hurt. A lot of us have a hard time hearing it. But instead of just like having this emotional explosion, I do often have emotions. I take some time before I respond, but then I come back to it and I think this is a learning opportunity. Okay, this is a learning opportunity. Even if I get my craziest emails in the month of August and September, and it makes sense, because a lot of you are thrown into chaotic situations. And so you're acting chaotic, trying to scramble. And so sometimes that can result in like us, panic purchasing stuff that's not the right fit. And we didn't read the description or, maybe casting blame, getting defensive. That's my other advice. Like, don't get defensive. And that's what I tell myself too. You can state some facts, but I think always looking to how could I improve this? Every time I get negative feedback or critique, even if it feels really off base, I try to think, okay, what could I have done better? Is there any way I could have prevented this and learn from this in the future? Again, don't get defensive. I think look for solutions too with those critiques. I would hope that anyone who's critiquing your teaching is also being kind and gracious enough to offer solutions. And if they didn't, ask for suggestions. So if they just send you a form and there's some critiques and you're like, they critiqued this about me but didn't help me at all, I would ask to meet and say, hey, what would be some suggestions you have? That's a weakness of mine, clearly, that you identified. How could I do better here? I've told you before, one of my greatest weaknesses was always my interactions with parents. And I was called out for that at my second teaching job a lot. So I would say, okay, so what do I need to do better? What are some ideas how could I do this better? Give me some specifics. And one of my admin did that and really, really helped me grow in that area. So ask for that. I would also say too, affirmations should have been given with your critique. They should always be sharing positives. And if they're not, they should be. I want to tell you that. But also, I think it's fair to ask. I think it's fair to say, hey, I'm like so grateful for your critiques. I'm going to start working on these right now. Was there anything that I did well, like that stood out to you? Like just that you could affirm that would be really helpful for me and my confidence moving forward. I think it is so humble to ask for that. not to boost your ego, just to say like, hey, like, especially if you're a new teacher, like I want to have some more confidence moving forward. Is there anything you saw that you could kind of speak into me here? And I think every critique is an opportunity to get better, even if it's extremely uncomfortable. So I would see it as that way too. Instead of being paralyzed and freaked out that these people are coming, see it as an opportunity to improve. And if you improve, your job's going to get easier and you're going to get better. I think of me at, I started doing CrossFit like a year ago because my husband does it and I thought it would be a cool thing we could do together. And I just want to get stronger. And it's been a great community. It's been really fun. But y'all, if you've ever seen a picture of me or a video of me on the internet, then like you're aware I'm not strong. I've been told that I have bird arms for lots of years in my life. And so you can imagine me like trying to lift these barbells. I often embarrass myself, especially because most of the workouts are building workouts. So you start kind of small and then you build weight until basically you can't do it anymore. And it's been humbling, very, very humbling, especially like walking in where everyone is so much stronger than me. For example, I PR'd, so I hit a personal record the other day, and the personal record that I hit was 80 pounds, and my partner did 155 pounds. Yep, the partner that I had, she was another mom. She did 155 pounds, I did 80. But here's the thing, I'm getting stronger, and I'm not going to get stronger if I'm just constantly embarrassed that I'm behind everyone or I'm making mistakes and I have so much to learn. I can only get better if I open myself up to feedback. I get very nervous still. When my coach comes over and I'm doing a front squat, I get nervous. It doesn't make me feel very good to have him right there. But I know that I will get better at these things if I receive his feedback. And I will only get better and improve if I keep trying harder things. If I just always stay with the same weight, I'll never get better. I'll just be complacent. So you do have to push yourself a little bit. And so that's kind of the last encouragement I want to leave you with here is like, this is an opportunity to grow in humility, receive critiques, ask for solutions if they're not given, and grow. We will get stronger because of this. So I hope this helped you know kind of how to get prepared, what to do when they come, how to stay calm, how to respond if kids are crazy. Check out all of those things that I mentioned linked in the show notes. I think they will help you, those podcast episodes and things like that. Those are in the show notes, which you can find at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 146. And y'all, I just want you to know you've got this. Like you can do this. Do what you can now to set the procedures, set the rhythms, create the classroom culture that you want, and then don't worry about what's to come. Just hold the line when they come and then improve afterwards. And if you are listening and you've not left a review yet and you're a new teacher, today's the day. I would love it if you would leave a review for the podcast. It helps so much with people just finding the podcast and seeing that it has value in it. Hopefully you've gotten value from this. And if you aren't a new teacher and you're a veteran teacher and you managed to listen to this whole episode, thank you for listening. And I would love it if you would send this to someone who is a new teacher and could maybe benefit from hearing it. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.